As of today, it has been exactly 10 years since the release of the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, an unprecedented adaptation of existing Steins Gate side material that served to expand upon the circumstances that made the ending of the original Steins Gate possible. Those being Arclight of the Pointed Infinity, the Epigraph light novel trilogy, and the ending of Annularly Chained Ouroboros. But after a decade, how well has Steins Gate Zero aged? The answer is complicated. Steins Gate Zero is a project that emerged under turbulent circumstances. It was announced around the time of the cancellation of Steins Gate's planned sequel, The Committee of Antimatter, and Chaos Child's disastrous launch on the Xbox One, timing that I do not believe is coincidental. Did they cancel The Committee of Antimatter in favor of making Steins Gate Zero? Or did they make Steins Gate Zero in part to make up for having to cancel The Committee of Antimatter? To this day, we do not know. But at the very least, the way many fans often perceive it, Steins Gate Zero exists because Mages was desperate to recoup their losses after disastrously miscalculating the performance of the Xbox One, and considering just how well Zero sold, 100,000 copies by day one, it was truly a move that paid off, at least financially. But in turn, it forever changed the direction SciTV went in afterwards, marking a pivot towards further hyper-focusing on the Steins Gate subseries. For an entry with such heavy baggage behind it, in this video, I will go over what I think has aged well about it, as well as what I think hasn't. Spoiler warning for the Steins Gate subseries, by the way. Starting off with what I think has aged well, the concept of worldline recursion, and the narrative's general design. The very basis of Steins Gate Zero hinges around this idea of world lines recursively serving as messengers to one another down this metaphorical chain of countless world lines, something which ties into the main OST of the game, Messenger. This is a holdover from the ending of Ouroboros, which outlines how the only reason that Operation Skuld was able to be possible was because of the efforts of countless iterations of Okabe, whose memories were eventually accumulated by the Okabe who ultimately recorded the video email. He was the final messenger, but far from the only messenger. There were countless dead zeros, hence the title Steins Gate Zero. Compared to the original Steins Gate, which is a much more standard time travel story, I always found the idea of Steins Gate Zero's narrative to be significantly more unique and thought-provoking. Unlike the original Steins Gate, where everything other than the true ending was little more than a what-if romance route, all the routes in Steins Gate Zero are vital to the narrative, each contributing a piece to the puzzle necessary for the conception of Operation Skuld. On top of the routes' narrative contributions, I also find that a decade later, much of the content within those routes is largely solid. They have incredibly high highs and a strong emotional core, regardless of whether they were adapted from prior material like Vega and Altair, or completely original like the Promised Renashimento. Okabe in Steins Gate Zero, while not as strong of a character as he is in the Epigraph trilogy, is still much more compelling to me than he is in the original Steins Gate. While you do end up losing the motif of the solitary observer by having multiple points of view, Okabe still ends up having a much more prominent character arc, and while I do wish they were bold enough to make him as unrecognizable from his former self as they did in Arclight and Epigraph, I still love the change Okabe undergoes over the course of the story of Steins Gate Zero. On note of the narrative design, let's talk about the Zero anime, the other part of Steins Gate Zero that I think has aged well. Steins Gate Zero's narrative is very peculiar in that both mediums' versions of the story are necessary to complete the tale. The visual novel shows the roots for 5 different worldline iterations that happened at some point within the chain, although we do not know the exact order in which they occur. The anime, meanwhile, shows a route for the very final iteration of the story, the tale of the final Okabe who ultimately recorded the video email for Operation Skuld. The ending of this final Okabe's journey is shown for a mere 20 minutes in the Zero visual novel. The majority of it remained unseen until the Zero anime. In those respects, the Zero anime is more akin to a final route for the Zero visual novel as opposed to a conventional adaptation of it. Considering the design of the game and the linearity that an anime is supposed to have, I think this was definitely the right decision. Instead of making an incomplete adaptation of an incomplete story, they made a complement that completed the story. And I still remember what it was like watching Steins Gate Zero as it aired weekly back in the day. That was An unbelievable experience. It answered so many questions I'd had not only from the Zero visual novel, but also the side material it was based on. For longtime fans who'd been following the series since the original visual novel's release, I can only imagine how it felt to get an answer to what happened to Mayuri, Suzuha, and Okabe after Arclight. Just generally, the anime also made for a more coherent experience of Steins Gate Zero by virtue of it being locked into the perspective of the final messenger. To this day, I still find that most ardent SciTV fans prefer the Zero anime to the Zero visual novel, myself included. Heck, I even prefer the Zero anime to the original anime, even with the original significantly stronger direction and animation. After all, the Zero anime is the most useful SciTV anime to date because it isn't just a watered-down version of its source material. Rather, it's an essential part of the overall series narrative, even foreshadowing future installments like Anonymous Code. And that, to me, has aged incredibly well. If there's one last thing I can say that I think has aged especially well for Steins Gate Zero, it's the music. Though I can say that about pretty much every SciTV entry. After all, Takashi Abo never misses with his work, and the same was true for Steins Gate Zero. The visual novel has so many of my favorite tracks from SciTV, including the likes of Messenger, Reawake, Logical, and more. And the Zero anime also has some outstanding tracks, like Okabe's Defiance, Last Mission, and Mayuri's Sadness. In terms of music, I think Steins Gate Zero was overall an upgrade over the original Steins Gate. So that to me is one element of it that has aged amazingly. But now, let's move into what hasn't aged well. First up is ironically the very thing I praise Steins Gate Zero for, its design. As much as I adore the very concept of worldline recursion, I think the execution of it left much to be desired. Specifically in the sense of it often being too hard to wrap your head around, or straight up just easy for people to miss when they're lacking context. It's understandable if someone who only goes through the Zero anime misses what worldline recursion is, because that itself only shows one iteration. But there's also a lot of people out there who go through both the Zero visual novel and the Zero anime, and yet still miss how the roots are related to one another, thereby also missing the entire point of the story. And I do not think this is so much a matter of media literacy as it is just poor design on Mages' part. Worldline recursion might be obvious to someone who has gone through the side material Steins Gate Zero is based on, but this idea should have been made much more explicit within Steins Gate Zero itself. And confusion surrounding that idea was made worse specifically because of bizarre choices the creators made and how they portrayed worldline recursion. For instance, the game presents Milky Way crossing immediately after Vega and Altair, almost making it seem like the former is a direct continuation of the latter, even though it's not. This is explicitly confirmed in the Amadeus script guidebook, which states that there are countless recursive iterations that take place in between Vega and Altair and Milky Way crossing, so Milky Way crossing is not some random epilogue to Vega and Altair. And yet I still come across so many people who misunderstand this aspect about the series' chronology. What the SciTV team should have done in-game was make a separate true end button on screen like they did for so many other games in the series. That would have avoided this decade-long confusion. Additionally, the D-Rhine from the Promised Renishimento is yet another common point of confusion. For a long time, because of the way in which the series' mechanics work, many hypothesized that the D-Rhine to branch onto Milky Way crossing was from an unseen iteration with a future presumably identical to that of the Vega and Altair route, even though the D-Rhine's contents were identical to what was sent in the Promised Renishimento. After all, worldlines in Steins Gate Zero work recursively, and how else could a D-Rhine from the Promised Renishimento get sent to the past of the Vega and Altair route on a completely different worldline with a completely different history? That aspect of the story, seemingly being a contradiction, is acknowledged in the Amadeus script guidebook, but the creators' explanation of this phenomenon is also very vague and unclear, with them stating that they didn't apply any logic towards which worldline received the D-Rhine, and that it worked the way that the Kurisu Death D-Mail and the Operation Scald Video D-Mail worked. I've seen people interpret these comments as them either just letting there be a plot hole, or that the D-Rhine operates by a worldline targeting system, very similar to how the encrypted Nostalgia Drive is sent for Operation Scald. Whatever the case happened to be, this point needed to be made far more explicit in-game. The fact that this point is still discussed a decade after the game's release is yet another aspect of it that just has not aged well. And I think one major contributor to the very existence of these shortcomings was the game's incredibly rushed development timeline. With how dire Mage's circumstances were following the cancellation of the Committee of Antimatter, and Chaos Child being a commercial flop at launch, Steins Gate Zero was forced out in a matter of mere months after its announcement. They needed their money back ASAP, hence why they chose to make something based off of existing side material. That helped substantially cut down the game's development time, but even with much of the story having existed already, the development team still ended up having to cut corners. The Amadeus script guidebook described some plot elements that they wanted to write into the Zero visual novel that they simply were not able to. Some of these ended up being covered later on in the Steins Gate Zero anime, like with how the 3000 time leaps worked, but content from the planned Fubuki route ended up having to be completely discarded and relegated into a drama CD. And like the cut content, I think the holes they'd left in the visual novel's incomplete story were a result of the game's rushed development. That leads me into the next aspect about Steins Gate Zero that I don't think has aged well: tonal clashes. Presumably due to time constraints, there's a good number of sprites and CGs within Steins Gate Zero that are straight up reused from earlier Steins Gate games, despite being in completely different art styles. And while that's definitely not a huge deal for a visual novel, a decade later, it's still something I find a little jarring. Mayuri, for instance, looks completely different from scene to scene, and it feels so off. However, it's not just artwork that I find clashing in tone, it's also the constant juxtaposition of dark, depressing material with completely random fan service. This happens way too many times throughout Steins Gate Zero. You have a very somber scene, only for it to be interrupted by completely random fan service. It is true that Steins Gate Zero is a side AV side entry, very much like Robotics Notes Dash and the LCC games, so you shouldn't go into it expecting the very same kind of tone you would get out of a mainline, but still, I find these recurring tonal clashes simply have not aged well for the game. I guess if there's one last thing about Steins Gate Zero that I'd say hasn't aged well either, it's changes in character designs. And no, I don't mean things like Okabe looking like a giraffe in some CGs, I mean the fundamental change in appearances from previous renditions of Arclight and Epigraph. For instance, let's look at Okabe. The whole idea of Okabe's design in Epigraph is that he's supposed to be completely unrecognizable from who he was before, a shell of his former self. And in Steins Gate Zero, they change him to look exactly like how he does in the original, but in a black suit. I understand the brand recognition element behind doing this. You need consumers to recognize the protagonist of your cash cow. But from a thematic standpoint, I just don't like this change at all. For me, it takes away from some of the emotional core behind what Steins Gate Zero was based on. Another one of these problematic character design changes was with Kagari. Originally in the Epigraph trilogy, there was never any of this nonsense about looking like Kurisu, because Kagari's hair was red and Kurisu's hair was chestnut colored, hence the Kuri part of her name. But because the Steins Gate anime had made Kurisu's hair red instead, fans commented at the time of the Epigraph trilogy's release that Kagari and Kurisu looked quite similar to one another. They then decided to play upon these fan comments and legitimately turn that into a plot point within Steins Gate Zero. I personally don't think it's the worst plotline in the world. It does tie in to an extent with series-wide themes. But I do think that Kagari might have been a more interesting character in Steins Gate Zero had they just not deliberately made her into more of a Kurisu lookalike. At the very least, we wouldn't constantly have had all these crazy clone theories on Reddit. Honestly, I think one thing that would have made Kagari's character more interesting was if they had confirmed her biological parents were a certain duo from Robotics Notes. But even with what's been presented in Steins Gate Zero alone, that's ironically a plausible theory. I just wish there was more to go off of, so it wouldn't just be headcanon. All in all, the confusing structure-related choices, tonal clashes, and character design changes don't outright ruin Steins Gate Zero for me, but I do think they contributed to holding it back from what could have been something better. Though that just about encapsulates what I think hasn't aged well about Steins Gate Zero. So overall, How has Steins Gate Zero aged in the span of a decade? I know I spoke at length about my criticisms for it, but I'd say that all in all, it's still a fascinating, heart-filled part of the SciTV storyline. It made for a far more accessible version of the content depicted in some of the most important pieces of Steins Gate side material. Fans often complain that Steins Gate Zero is just a worse version of the side material it adapted. And to be fair, I do agree with that sentiment to an extent, but as such, if there's any game that could use a remake in the SciTV franchise, I think it's Steins Gate Zero. After all, the way it stands, people need to go through both the Zero visual novel and the Zero anime at the very least. Heck, for people to have a complete understanding, then that requires the side material Steins Gate Zero is based off of as well. I think it would be nice to have one definitive version of Steins Gate Zero, combining all of that in one package. They announced Steins Gate Zero Elite almost 6 years ago, but considering the steep costs of that, who knows if that's ever happening. Looking at recent comments concerning Steins Gate Reboot, it seems as though the team is moving away from fully animated ADV games due to cost and workload. But with them seemingly making Steins Gate Reboot to facilitate future series development, I wouldn't be surprised if one day we see a Steins Gate Zero reboot. And that, to me, would have potential to make a truly definitive version of Steins Gate Zero. I hope that one day we'll see it come to fruition. Please let me know what Steins Gate Zero means to you after 10 years. I'm someone who started Steins Gate before the Zero visual novel was even announced, so I'm one of those longtime fans who had been eagerly awaiting the chance to play the Zero visual novel and then later on watch the Zero anime. I look back upon that experience so fondly. But in any case, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.